The original Guild Wars is unlike any MMO I've ever played. A few months back in October, I reviewed Guild Wars 2 as a new player and shared my first impressions of the game. While I think Guild Wars 2 is fantastic in many different ways, it's a pretty standard modern MMO with a lot of familiar systems, and gameplay-wise, it feels very similar to most MMOs that you play these days. I was assuming that Guild Wars 1 would at least be comparable and similar in some ways, but really, other than the story and the world, the games couldn't be more different. The original Guild Wars was published and released by ArenaNet in 2005. I remember playing this game for a very brief time as a child, but I don't remember much. I think I was under the assumption that the game was too difficult, and so I probably returned to WoW and RuneScape pretty quickly. Guild Wars is a buy-to-play game featuring 3 separate versions, though they were all just additions to the base game. Prophecies, Factions, Nightfall, and finally an expansion known as Eye of the North, which helped to bridge the gap in the story between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2. I personally purchased all 3 versions in a bundle pack on Steam, and today we're going to jump into Guild Wars, try and reach the max level, and explore some of the content that the game has to offer. I want to find out what are the similarities between these 2 versions of Guild Wars, but also what are the differences? And mainly, I want to answer the question: is the OG Guild Wars worth picking up and playing in the year 2024? But before we get into that, I would just like to remind everyone that channel memberships are active. If you enjoy MMOs and you enjoy my content, please think about supporting me further. If that's not your cup of tea, then a like and a subscription are a big help as well. Thanks, now let's get into the video. When you first create a character in Guild Wars, it's going to ask you if you want to choose between a role-playing character as well as a PvP-only character. I didn't really understand or know the difference between the options at the time, but if you create a PvP character, they will start at the max level of 20 with a decent set of gear and abilities to try your talent against other players. PvP is still available on a role-playing character, but you'll have to level up and acquire all of your own gear. Afterwards, you're given the option of choosing the campaign or version of the game that you wish to start with. I think for any newer players watching this video that want to level up or gain experience faster, you might want to choose the newer campaigns, though beware, the content may be more difficult. As I wanted to play the original Guild Wars in the most original way, I chose Prophecies. After that, you can choose between 6 professions: Warrior, Ranger, Monk, Necromancer, Mesmer, and Elementalist. You might find some of those familiar if you've played Guild Wars 2. When I played Guild Wars 2, I was a Char Ranger, so because of that, in order to equally compare the games, I figured I should choose to be a Ranger in Guild Wars 1 as well. Little did I know at the time that comparing combat between these 2 versions of the game is like trying to compare apples to pumpkins. I chose to be a male and realized you can't pick a race. The only playable race in Guild Wars is human, which is quite the difference when compared to Guild Wars 2. After some basic customization options and dyeing all of my gear a nice Ranger green, I was ready to finish character creation. That is, until I got to choosing a name where you kind of have to have a first and a last name. The game requires at least 2 separate words to make up your character's name, and unfortunately Way space dot was not allowed, so I chose Way space dot. Fancy. Alright, we're in. You're greeted with a cutscene and a voiceover that explains a bit of the intro to the story. I was actually pretty impressed with the graphics of the game thus far, considering its year of release. Many other games released in the same time frame didn't look quite this crisp. It's definitely not modern, but it's not as dated as others. I changed around a couple of the graphical settings, managed to get it into windowed mode, and took a peruse around the user interface. Once again, it feels quite modern considering the age of the game. A nice action bar, minimap, party interface. It really doesn't take up too much real estate, and overall it's very simple but sleek. Now, in Guild Wars, you can click to move or use WASD. This is where it definitely starts to show its age a little bit. Movement is pretty limited. Pressing spacebar doesn't make you jump, but instead runs your character directly to your target. You can move around the camera with the right mouse button, and while it feels a little older, it doesn't take too much time to get used to. There's a quest completion indicator telling me where to go on the minimap, which is always nice, and wow, Ascalon looks really beautiful. It seems Guild Wars exists somewhere in the middle between modern and dated graphics, which lends itself to this unique feel where sometimes despite sharp polygonal edges and lesser detailed textures, it still seems to appear high quality in certain places. I made it to the town center, and actually I was kind of surprised to see quite a few other characters standing around and hanging out. Now, unbeknownst to me at the time, I was standing in what is known as pre-Searing Ascalon, originally intended to be a tutorial to the game where you can level up for a little while before going to the main game known as post-Searing. Some of these accounts are actually quite impressive, as once you leave pre-Searing Ascalon, you can never return, and mobs and quests only go up to a certain level in this area, making getting to the max level of 20 quite a challenge. As I mentioned before, I had no idea about the Searing or how any of this worked at the time, but a lot of people really enjoy the pre-Searing challenge in Guild Wars 1. Basically, seeing how high of a level you can get in what is essentially just the tutorial area. It's pretty cool. I went through a quick loading screen into Lakeside County and picked up another quest which wanted me to slay a horde of scale. I looked through some of the menus to see if I had any abilities available to use in combat, but not yet apparently. To attack a target, you just click on them and your character will begin auto-attacking. My auto-attack is fairly slow, and with no usable abilities yet, it sort of felt like old school RuneScape in a way. Just click and wait. I received my first piece of loot, an air wand. Interestingly, the tooltip says it's unidentified, but I could still equip it. You can generally equip other types of weapons and armor in the game, but later on there are certain skill requirements in order to do so. I figured as a ranger, however, I should generally stick with a bow. Interesting, completing this quest actually unlocked 2 abilities for me. You can acquire abilities by purchasing them using various currencies, as well as from completing quests. Later on, you're going to find that some abilities are much more difficult to unlock, but also much more powerful. I traveled a bit further and I was really beginning to get swept up in this area. Pre-Searing Ascalon is this beautiful, peaceful place with golden green fields, waterfalls, and mountains. It's hard not to feel right at home. I was directed to go back to Ascalon City, so I checked the map to remember the way. And wow, fast travel. That's definitely not something that was very common to see in MMOs in 2005. After returning to the original quest giver, I was given a new quest, an option to pick a second profession. Now, you don't have to pick a second profession, but the implications of this are too cool. You can basically mix and match any of the options of the classes available in the game. You could be a warrior mesmer or a monk elementalist. This absolutely blew me away, and I was taken aback at the realization that the amount of playable classes in the game just went from 6 to 36. I wanted to choose something different and something interesting, so I chose to be a ranger necromancer. The game then directed me to the necromancer profession teacher, who taught me a few necromancy abilities and asked me to follow her into the catacombs. We took down a couple of skeletons, which actually got me my first level, level 2, bringing up an attribute page where you can slot in skill points into different types of profession-specific attributes, which will dictate the strength of certain abilities. Afterwards, I was told to animate this corpse in order to summon a familiar to fight by my side. Yep, sounds like necromancy. With the aid of my new necrotic familiar, I was able to take down this level 4 mob, and honestly, I was still just blown away at the fact that I was playing a ranger necromancer. I was already having an absolute blast, and the excitement for playing Guild Wars was growing. A lot of times when I review these older MMOs, there's a certain amount of out-of-datedness that can lend the game to feeling tedious and annoying and even boring at times. And I could already tell that I didn't think this was going to be quite the same case with Guild Wars 1. That is, until about 10 minutes later when I tried to do another simple side quest and I was immediately overwhelmed by 3 skeletons and I got completely wrecked. But I digress. I decided to continue on with what was considered my primary story quest in my quest log. This is the point where you will leave pre-Searing Ascalon. And I didn't really know this at the time, but it's recommended to at least stick around in the pre-Searing area for a while longer. Maybe get to like level 5 at least. Because you're going to find that the monsters and the quests and the areas all become significantly more difficult and further spaced out once you get into the post-Searing part of the game. When you begin the story mission, you're given a party of henchmen. I wasn't aware at the time, but these are going to be your aides in any given combat for literally the rest of the game. In Guild Wars, you almost never play solo in the sense that you always have henchmen or heroes with you to aid you in combat. But we'll get into more on that later on. Henchmen and having a party makes combat about 10 times easier. Guaranteed if I was still playing solo, as I was before, these groups of enemies would have made easy work of my lackluster level 2 Ranger Necromancer. After finishing the story quest, you're met with another cutscene that explains that what you know of the beautiful, grassy, peaceful area of Ascalon will never be the same because the Char attacked. Which also made me feel super guilty about maining a Char in Guild Wars 2. Anyways, your character is taken 2 years into the future into what is known as post-Searing Ascalon. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little lost at this point. I was just introduced to this beautiful world and now it's gone and destroyed. The monsters around this area seemed higher level and I was worried that I had made some sort of grave mistake. I zoned back into Ascalon City, which is really hardly a city now, just some tents and crumbling ruins, and I couldn't help but feel a little sad. I picked up some of the quests in the area and I decided to get to work. When I zoned out of Ascalon and back into the combat zone of Old Ascalon, I was surprised to see that the party of henchmen from the story quest were still with me. Admittedly, at the time, I thought this was potentially some sort of bug. I was a little naive. After a bit of questing, I got to level 3 and I even received some new skills, one for necromancy and one for ranger. I decided to take a small break and grab a bite to eat, and upon logging back in, it turns out I was sent back to Ascalon City. So if you ever log out while you're in a combat zone, you're immediately teleported to the closest safe zone. I went back into the combat zone and this time my party of henchmen were no longer with me. I accepted my fate that I would now be a lone ranger trying to make his way through the world, and that bug that I experienced prior where the quest NPCs stayed with me is no more. How the hell am I supposed to do this? Everywhere I go, everything is just destroying me. I'm always dead. What is going on? This game is so absurdly difficult. I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing and why is everything going wrong? Maybe I'll just quit this video and never play Guild Wars again. Oh, you can just go back into town and reassign the henchmen to your party, and then they follow you everywhere and help you in combat zones. Okay, cool. That's easy. Overall, combat is very unique in Guild Wars 1. You essentially need to optimize your party for whatever content you're going to be taking on. You'll always want a healer in order to keep your party's health topped up, as well as for resurrecting dead party members. This circle on the minimap will indicate your party's aggro range, and maneuvering through maps is often done by slowly making your way around large groups of enemies. It's fun in its own way, but there is a bit of jankiness to combat. First of all, many abilities cost quite a large amount of energy, which is this blue bar you see down here. Through certain builds and attribute points, you can reduce this cost. However, energy regeneration is just pretty slow, and I found myself often just waiting for my energy to build up in order to use more abilities. It took me a while to really get into the groove of Guild Wars combat, but you kind of have to change your mindset a bit. It's a lot less about controlling just your character, but it's really about controlling and manipulating your entire group in order to take down enemies. It's vastly different to what you see in most MMOs these days, and while at first I thought it was quite janky, after a while it was beginning to grow on me. With the right strategy, setup, and planning, you really should be able to take down any group of enemies, and it's an entirely new skill set that I had to learn while playing Guild Wars. Through some more questing and combat, I got myself to level 4, and I was feeling pretty good about my progress. Leveling was a very slow experience, especially as a new player who went into post-Searing Ascalon a little early. But it does make sense considering the max level in this game is only 20, which is quite a bit lower from a lot of other games. I found a Master Ranger who had some quests which could grant me Ranger skills. But I was a little bit confused because one of her quests asked me to use the Charm Animal ability in order to acquire a pet. However, one of the quest rewards was the ability to Charm Animal, which I didn't currently have yet. I also got a short sprint ability, which definitely will help with mobility, as Guild Wars 1 doesn't feature any form of mount for you to be able to travel faster. I took a break for the night and I decided to continue on tomorrow. I was feeling a little overwhelmed with a lot of information, and it can be difficult to look things up for Guild Wars 1. As it's such an old game, you often lead yourself to forums and discussions that happened over a decade ago. That being said, the next day when I logged in, I decided to just explore the town, see what kind of NPCs I could find, look at the items and things you can buy in order to familiarize myself a bit more with the game and what I should really be working towards. I found a merchant which sold bags to increase my inventory space, which was a very welcome sight. I also found out about salvage and identification kits. Salvage kits allow you to disassemble your loot into crafting items, and identification kits are used to identify the stats that are on certain pieces of equipment which drop from enemies. I found a rune vendor who sold runes, which basically act as enchantments which you can put on your gear in order to give them better stats. Afterwards, I learned about customizing your weapon to your character, essentially binding it to your character, which gives it a percentage damage increase. And I found the bank, which you can purchase an account that allows you to store quite a large amount of items, as well as an unlimited amount of crafting materials. And finally, I found the skill vendor, where you can buy skills. And I found the skill Charm Animal, so I could finally work towards that quest and get myself a pet. Boom. Pet acquired. I also learned about certain NPCs in the world who act as collectors. Essentially, by trading specific items to a collector, you can get rewards. This particular one wanted 3 scorched lodestones, which drop from some of the enemies in the area, in order to exchange for what looked to be a pretty decent bow. I was fighting these stone elementals for about 20 minutes in order to get the item to drop 3 separate times, but afterwards I got my new bow. It doesn't look too different, but it's quite a bit more powerful. Afterwards, I continued questing. I made my way into the breach, following a soldier to Pick and Square. I got to level 6, and that's when I realized the henchmen in Pick and Square were actually level 6 as well. You see, henchmen in certain areas will be higher level depending on the actual mobs in that area. However, if I were to go back to Old Ascalon or Ascalon City, I would still have the level 3 henchmen from that area. I found this new area of the breach to be quite challenging as well, and I decided that I might be doing something wrong. I couldn't help but feel like I was missing some sort of progression. So I did a bit of research, and that's when I found out about missions. You see, in order to progress through Prophecy's storylines, you have to participate in missions. These are instanced story quests with cutscenes and challenging scenarios that you complete in order to get quite a large chunk of experience. The first one I participated in is known as the Great Northern Wall. While fighting through the mission, I got to level 7, and after some cutscenes and racing back to the wall on a timer, I was granted with the mission complete reward of 1,000 experience. Quite a bit larger than the quest rewards I was receiving prior, and this took me almost halfway to level 8. And this is when the game really started to open up for me. The missions take you on an absolute journey through most of the available map, starting in Ascalon. I got a cool purple staff, helped fire some trebuchet, and boom, level 8. Not long after that, while learning about Stormcaller, I ended up getting to level 9. This is what my map looked like so far after having just completed a few of those missions. Lots of times when you finish a mission, the story progression takes you to the next area where you can progress. In each of these side areas, you'll find other side quests and things to participate in, or you can just do the next mission to progress further. A bit longer later, I found myself in a more snowy environment in Yak's Bend. Here, I found an NPC which could craft me some new armor using some of the crafting materials that I had acquired during my travels. Crafting works a little bit different in Guild Wars. It's not like a profession or something that you can actually level up. Essentially, there's just NPCs who can craft things for you as long as you have the required coins and crafting materials in order to do so. I picked myself up a new mask, as well as some fur-lined armor that had better stats. Here, there was also a wider variety of henchmen to choose from. These ones were level 8, and there were a few new types which I could add to my party. On top of that, in the zones that I was in prior, my party size was only 4. But in this area, I could have up to 6 people in my party, basically taking a mini raid into every combat zone. I continued questing through this area and officially hit halfway to max, with level 10. Also, through some more research online, I found out about the bonus command. Essentially, if you have certain versions of the game and you type /bonus item in the chat box, you actually get rewarded with some really good things. I got a new bow that was about 10 times better than the one I was using prior, and on top of that, I received an item which could summon another familiar to also fight by my side. So at this point, I could essentially have me, 5 henchmen, my pet, an item-based familiar, as well as a necromancy familiar, all fighting for me at the same time. Eventually, I made it to an area known as Beacon's Preach. I accidentally went the wrong way and saw a level 24 mob. Okay, let's turn around. I finally got to level 11, and currently in my mission, I was journeying towards Lion's Arch, which I was pretty excited about because it's one of my favorite cities in Guild Wars 2. I must say, Lion's Arch looks dramatically different in Guild Wars 1. Apparently, the game's story takes place about 250 years apart, so it's kind of interesting to see what Lion's Arch looked like in the past. And it's cool to think that this small sort of encampment with a few buildings would end up becoming the majestic city that Lion's Arch is just 250 years later. Now, at this point in the game, you're given a few different options, though it's not communicated very well to the player. You see, this is the first point in the game where you're really able to travel between other versions of the game. While playing a Prophecies character like me, you have to get to Lion's Arch before you can travel to participate in content featured in Factions or Nightfall. You can do this by getting certain quests from other NPCs in Lion's Arch. I figured I'd seen a fair amount of the content that was available to me in Prophecies, so I decided to try my hand at the Nightfall version of the game. Now, in order to get to Nightfall, you have to follow a short quest line which will take you there. One of those quests, it turns out, requires fighting a bunch of level 22 mobs, and considering I was level 12 and my party of henchmen were all level 10 in this area, I got completely destroyed. So instead, I decided to see if I could make it to the Factions part of the game instead. The quests in order to get to Factions didn't require any difficult combat, and boom, I was there. Wait, all of my henchmen are level 20? And apparently I can have up to 8 of them at a time? And wait, This quest is gonna give me 3,000 experience? That's basically triple what I was receiving prior. Now, combat with this massive group of 8 level 20 henchmen was interesting. I was such a low level that I hardly did any damage, so I kind of just hang out, while my henchmen and whatever quest allies I had did all the work. The experience I was gaining in this area was much higher, the loot I was getting was much more valuable, and the money that dropped from monsters was also significantly more. It was quite a lot different from what I had experienced in Prophecies, though along with all of these better rewards came more challenge. I made it to the first level 20 mission in factions known as Vezina Square. And, well, let me just say this is the most challenging piece of content that I had come across thus far in Guild Wars. Essentially, you need to keep 2 NPCs alive for the entire duration of the mission, and it culminates in an area that has an absolutely absurd amount of enemies that do an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage. I spent about an hour or 2 on this mission and decided to give it another try the next day, upon which one of the NPCs died fairly early on before I could even make it to him. I decided I might just be too low level and not understanding enough about the game to get this done. I figured I would go do more side quests around the factions area in order to get some more 3,000 experience rewards. This is when I came across my first hero. Now, I was unaware of heroes at the time, but essentially heroes are just better versions of henchmen. You can decide and dictate what class a hero is and what abilities they have access to, and you can equip them with their own armor and weapons. You can slot certain abilities into their action bars, and on top of that, you can actually control them and tell them where to go and what to do, instead of just relying on the AI decisions of henchmen. With enough equipment and abilities unlocked, you and a team of 7 heroes can take on the hardest content in the game. But like I said, I didn't know about this at the time, and I was introduced to Mox, my first hero, a giant robot dervish. Another nice thing about heroes is that you can level them up and they will stay that level. So if I wanted to go back to old Ascalon, where I started for example, I could bring a team of level 20 heroes instead of using that team of level 3 henchmen. I found another player's achievement in the chat box, and I just want to give a special shout out to Hugh Janus. That is Hugh Janus for winning a battle in the Hall of Heroes. Now, doing the side quests and the combat in this area basically tripled my leveling speed. Soon I was level 14, and not long after that I was level 15, and just a little while after that I was level 16. I tried the Vezina Square mission one more time, still couldn't beat it, but a thought occurred to me. The quest I tried earlier in order to get into the Nightfall expansion that had the level 22 mobs, I might be able to do that now. So I made my way back to Lion's Arch and gave it my best shot. I died a couple of times, but learning to take it slow and pull the smallest group of mobs as possible, I was eventually able to get it done. And this took me to the land of Ilona, featured in the Nightfall addition to the game. Now, ideally, looking back on this, I would have chosen to start the game in Nightfall, I think. Because just the intro quests in this area already gave me access to a bunch of heroes, all with different classes and abilities, which you can then use to form your own custom party to take on the rest of the game with. I was given a quick tutorial on how heroes are controlled and how you can have certain ones stand defense in certain areas, depending on whatever situation you might be in. I got to level 17 and found another mission which was quite difficult. It seemed the composition of my heroes was unable to do enough damage to take down the mobs I was encountering. After a bit of playing around and a lot of research, I changed around some of my heroes' abilities and the classes that I had set up for my heroes, and eventually I was able to complete it. You see, this is kind of the true endgame of Guild Wars. You want to unlock as many abilities as possible for as many different classes as possible, which can take a very long time. But doing so allows for your team of heroes to be as powerful as possible. And on top of that, you want to level up all of your heroes to level 20, get them equipped in the best gear possible, and also just make sure they're positioned properly in order to really get the most out of your entire party. I can't tell you how much time I spent Googling different types of builds and learning where to unlock different abilities. I went down quite the rabbit hole trying to learn and understand this system and its metas. While I learned quite a bit, I would say I hardly scratched the surface of the knowledge that other people have about this game and progressing and creating the best party and hero setups. Getting your entire party to its best in slot scenario so you can participate in the hardest content in Guild Wars is a gargantuan task. And honestly, when this realization hit me, I was quite impressed with the depth that this knowledge added to the game. There is so much more to Guild Wars than meets the eye. I continued questing, participating in more missions. I got to level 18, I herded some cows, got to level 19, I handed in 6,000 experience and quest rewards all at once, and finally, I got to level 20. Now, 20 is the max level in the game, but you'll notice that my XP bar can still gain XP. Once you're maxed in Guild Wars, you can actually continue to gain attribute points and skill points in order to learn new skills for other classes up to a certain point by gaining experience. At this point, I figured I had played enough to at least share my first impressions of Guild Wars, talk about the comparisons between the original game and the very popular Guild Wars 2, and answer that burning question. Is it worth playing Guild Wars in 2024? So, first of all, my realistic expectation of MMORPGs that were released prior to like 2010 are almost never high. I've played quite a few of these games, most of them feel dated to a point of tediousness that it's no longer really fun to participate in. With Guild Wars, in some cases, this is true. The movement is awful, you can't jump, and many times you run into invisible walls and areas that look like you could easily walk over them, but you're blocked off. The combat can feel slow, and the game is rather difficult and unforgiving in certain areas, which can feel janky. However, I was thoroughly impressed with just the level of fun that I had playing the game. When I switched my mindset of playing just my character to instead formulating, coordinating, and strategizing combat through my entire party, everything changed. Guild Wars is more strategy and planning in combat rather than just parsing through a rotation really well. Guild Wars requires you to be positional and constantly paying attention to not only your health, but also the health of every one of your party members. The game world and story, while outdated graphically at times, I think it still holds up quite well in the year 2024, and I found myself quite heavily immersed in multiple parts of the game, especially when checking out Nightfall and factions. The option to leave your character in pre-Searing Ascalon in order to have this self-made challenge in which you attempt to reach level 20 in what is essentially a tutorial zone is one of the coolest things about the game, in my opinion. It's a bit of a relic from older MMOs, and developers these days often see something like that as an oversight, but it allows the player base to come up with so many cool, fun, and unique ways to play a game. I definitely plan on trying to make a pre-Searing Ascalon character in the future. Speaking of making new characters, I still couldn't believe how cool the dual profession system is. It truly blew my mind that at the beginning of the game, there are so many forms of customization in terms of classes. And what's awesome is later on when you get access to heroes, all of them have a base class, but you can choose the secondary class for each one of your heroes as well. There's really an endless amount of different builds and customizations that you can play with. And I was constantly amazed at just how different Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 are. While both good games in their own right, they are vastly different, and it's actually quite difficult to even compare the two. Besides universe and story, almost nothing about the two games is similar. So here's my recommendation. If you haven't played Guild Wars 2, I'm going to have to recommend that you play it first. It's probably one of the highest praised MMOs out there currently. It's a fantastic game, and if you're used to more modern MMO systems, you're going to find it much easier to acclimate yourself. That being said, if you dislike modern MMOs and you constantly find yourself returning to older games that you used to play when you were younger, Guild Wars 1 might just be one of the best older MMO options available. And on top of that, if you're a Guild Wars 2 player and you've never tried Guild Wars 1, I can almost guarantee that you will find enjoyment in the original version of the game. Constantly seeing the lore that transcended over 250 years is a pretty cool experience. But I would be highly cautious and make sure that you are aware that the games are drastically different in terms of gameplay and feel. With all that being said, there is hundreds, potentially thousands of hours of fun, customizable possibilities, and achievements that you can strive and shoot for in the original Guild Wars. I absolutely recommend the game in 2024, and I'm happy to say that I was quite pleasantly surprised by how much fun I had playing this almost 2-decade-old game. Anyway, folks, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a subscription. Those things help a bunch. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. But anyways, I will catch you all in the next one. Later.